Hey folks, I'm excited to share some stories with you today that I've written myself. Whether you're a long-time follower or just joining us, I'd love to hear your thoughts on these tales. Don't forget to give this video a like and subscribe if you're new here. Let's dive in, and I hope you enjoy. If you come up on a hidden Disney show on the dark web, don't watch it. I know how ridiculous the title sounds, but if you value your sanity, you'll take my story seriously. This all started about a year ago, during one of those sleepless nights when I found myself browsing the darkest corners of the internet out of sheer boredom. I'd always been fascinated by urban legends and creepypasta, and the dark web seemed like the natural next step in my quest for chills. That's where my curiosity almost cost me my life. It was around 3 a.m., the witching hour, and I was about 6 pages deep into a forum dedicated to obscure horror content. People were sharing links to unsettling videos, forbidden books, and other macabre media. Most of it was tame, shaky found footage, or laughably bad attempts at horror. But then, a post caught my eye. Hidden Disney show, the dark truth behind the magic. The post was brief, just a few sentences and a link, but it promised something truly disturbing. It claimed that this video was a hidden Disney show that never aired, buried deep within the company's vaults for reasons unknown. The poster warned that watching it could lead to severe psychological trauma, or worse. Naturally, I dismissed the warnings as typical internet bullshit, meant to scare off the faint-hearted. I clicked the link. The video was hosted on a shady-looking website I had never seen before. The page was bare, just a black background with a single video player in the center. There were no ads, no pop-ups, nothing. It was as if the site was designed for this video alone. I hesitated for a moment, a sense of foreboding washing over me, but I shook it off and hit play. The video started innocuously enough, with the classic blue Disney castle intro, but something was off. The music was distorted, slowed down to a menacing drone. The screen flickered, showing brief flashes of unsettling images, screaming faces, decaying bodies, and symbols I didn't recognize. I paused the video and tried to go back, but the controls wouldn't respond. It was as if the site had taken control of my computer. Panic set in, but my curiosity overpowered it. I pressed play again, my heart pounding in my chest. The screen went black for a few seconds before cutting to a scene that looked like an old Disney cartoon. It featured Mickey Mouse, but this wasn't the cheerful, happy Mickey I grew up with. He was disheveled, with bloodshot eyes and a twisted grin that sent shivers down my spine. The scene unfolded in a surreal, nightmarish landscape. Mickey wandered through a dark forest. The trees gnarled and twisted like skeletal hands. Whispers filled the background, unintelligible but deeply unsettling. Mickey seemed to be searching for something, his movements jittery and unnatural. The animation was choppy, almost as if it was made by an amateur, but there was something deeply wrong about it. As Mickey ventured deeper into the forest, the whispers grew louder. I could make out phrases now, spoken in a language I didn't recognize. The words were harsh, guttural, and filled with malice. Mickey stumbled upon a clearing where a circle of robed figures stood around a large, ornate symbol etched into the ground. My blood ran cold as I realized it was a pentagram. The figures chanted in unison, their voices merging into a cacophony of malevolent sound. Mickey's expression twisted further, a mix of fear and curiosity. He approached the circle, and the chanting stopped, abruptly. The silence was deafening, a stark contrast to the chaos that preceded it. One of the robed figures stepped forward, pulling back their hood to reveal a face that was horribly disfigured, as if burned and mutilated. The figure spoke directly to Mickey, but the words were distorted, like a voice underwater. Mickey nodded slowly, and the figure handed him a ceremonial dagger. My stomach churned as I watched Mickey take the dagger and step into the circle. The figures resumed their chant, louder and more frenzied than before. Mickey raised the dagger high, his eyes wild with a mix of fear and madness. Suddenly, the video cut to black, and a message appeared on the screen. "This is only the beginning." My computer shut down on its own, and I sat there in the darkness, my heart racing and my mind reeling. What the hell had I just watched? Sleep was out of the question. I spent the rest of the night scouring the internet for any information about the video. There were no references, no mentions, nothing. It was as if the video didn't exist. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. My house felt colder, the shadows longer and darker. Over the next few days, strange things started happening. I'd wake up with scratches on my arms. My belongings would move around on their own, and I started having vivid nightmares of the robed figures. In every dream, they got closer, their chants louder and more insistent. I began to feel like I was being watched, even when I was alone. One night, I woke up to the sound of whispering. I bolted upright in bed, my heart hammering in my chest. The whispers were coming from the hallway. I grabbed a flashlight and crept out of my bedroom, the beam of light shaking in my trembling hand. As I approached the source of the whispers, I saw that my computer had turned on by itself. The same video was playing, but this time it was different. Mickey was now in a dark room, surrounded by the robed figures. They were chanting louder than ever, their voices a distorted symphony of horror. Mickey's eyes were wide with terror, his body trembling. The figure with the disfigured face stepped forward, raising the dagger high. I couldn't look away, even though every instinct screamed at me to turn off the computer and run. The figure plunged the dagger into Mickey's chest, and he let out a blood-curdling scream. The screen went black, and a new message appeared. "You have been marked." The computer shut down again, and I sat there in the darkness, my mind racing and my heart pounding. What did it mean? Who had marked me? I didn't sleep at all that night. The next day, I started noticing more scratches, deeper this time, and my nightmares became more intense. I felt like I was losing my mind. I tried to tell my friends, but they just laughed it off, thinking it was another one of my creepypasta stories. But this was real. I could feel it. One night, I woke up to find my bedroom door open. I never slept with the door open. The whispers were back, louder and more insistent. I got out of bed, feeling a sense of dread that I couldn't shake. As I stepped into the hallway, I saw them, the robed figures from the video, standing in my living room, their faces hidden in the shadows. They were chanting, their voices a low, sinister hum. I backed away slowly, but they started to move toward me. I turned and ran, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't know where to go, but I knew I had to get out of the house. As I reached the front door, I felt a cold hand grab my arm. I screamed and pulled away, but the grip tightened, dragging me back into the darkness. I woke up in my bed, drenched in sweat. The house was silent, but I knew they were still there, watching, waiting. I didn't know what to do. I couldn't go to the police. They'd think I was crazy. I couldn't tell my friends. They wouldn't believe me. I was trapped, alone with the knowledge that I had been marked by something evil. That was just the beginning. I tried to return to normal life, but the sense of dread followed me everywhere. Every shadow seemed to harbor a hidden menace, and every whisper of wind carried echoes of the chant. Days blurred into nights as my mind became a prison of paranoia. I tried to distract myself with work and friends, but nothing seemed to help. One evening, I received an email from an unknown sender. The subject line read, "I can help you." My heart raced as I opened it. The email was short, just a few sentences. "I know what you're going through. I've been there. If you want answers, meet me at the old warehouse on Elm Street at midnight. Come alone." I should have deleted it. I should have ignored it. But desperation has a way of clouding judgment. I needed answers, and if this person had them, I had to find out. That night, I drove to the warehouse. It was an abandoned building, covered in graffiti and surrounded by overgrown weeds. I parked my car and hesitated for a moment before stepping out. The air was thick with anticipation and fear. As I approached the entrance, a figure emerged from the shadows. He was tall and thin, with a hood covering most of his face. He gestured for me to follow him inside. The interior was dimly lit by a few flickering fluorescent lights, casting eerie shadows on the walls. The man led me to a small room in the back, furnished with a single table and 2 chairs. "Sit," he said, his voice gravelly and low. I did as he instructed, my mind racing with questions. He sat across from me and pulled back his hood, revealing a face lined with age and sorrow. "You watched the video, didn't you?" he asked, his eyes boring into mine. I nodded, too scared to speak. He sighed heavily. "I was like you once. Curious. Foolish. That video is a doorway. A beacon for something ancient and malevolent. The robed figures you saw, they're part of a cult that worships a dark entity. By watching the video, you've opened yourself to them. They've marked you as one of their own." I felt a chill run down my spine. "What do they want from me?" "To break you," he replied bluntly. "To turn you into one of them. The more you fear them, the stronger they become. They feed on your terror." I clenched my fists, trying to suppress the rising panic. How do I stop them? There's no easy way, he said, leaning closer. You have to face them. Confront the darkness within you. Only then can you hope to break free. The lights flickered, and for a moment I thought I saw the robed figures standing behind him, their faces hidden in the shadows. I blinked, and they were gone. Is there anyone else who can help me? I asked, my voice trembling. There's a woman, he said. She's an expert in the occult. She might know a way. Her name is Lydia. She lives in the old mansion at the edge of town. But be warned, seeking her help comes with its own dangers. I thanked him and left the warehouse, my mind racing with new fears and uncertainties. The drive to the mansion was a blur. The night seemed darker than usual, the shadows deeper and more menacing. When I arrived, the mansion loomed like a specter against the night sky, its windows dark and foreboding. I approached the front door and knocked, my heart pounding in my chest. After what felt like an eternity, the door creaked open, revealing a woman in her 50s with piercing green eyes and long silver hair. You must be the one, she said, her voice calm and measured. Come in. The interior of the mansion was dimly lit, filled with strange artifacts and symbols that made me uneasy. Lydia led me to a sitting room and motioned for me to sit. "I know why you're here," she said, sitting across from me. "You've been marked by the cult." I nodded, feeling a sense of déjà vu. She sighed, her eyes filled with a mix of sympathy and resolve. "The entity they worship is ancient and powerful. It thrives on fear and suffering. To break free, you must perform a ritual to sever the connection." "What kind of ritual?" I asked, dreading the answer. She handed me a small leather-bound book. "Everything you need to know is in here. But be warned, this is not without risk. The ritual will attract the entity, and it will do everything in its power to stop you." I took the book, my hands trembling. "What if I fail?" "Then you'll be lost to them," she said gravely. "Forever." As I left the mansion, the weight of what I had to do settled heavily on my shoulders. The book felt like a lead weight in my hands. I had no choice but to go through with it. I had to face the darkness, confront the cult, and sever the ties that bound me to their malevolent entity. It was the only way to reclaim my life, but the path ahead was shrouded in shadows and fraught with danger. Back home, I read through the book, trying to make sense of the ritual. It required a series of symbols to be drawn in a specific pattern, chants in an ancient language, and the use of certain items that wouldn't be easy to find. I spent the next few days gathering everything I needed, all the while feeling the presence of the cult growing stronger. They were watching, waiting, and I knew they would try to stop me. The night of the ritual arrived, and I prepared myself for what was to come. I drew the symbols on the floor, placed the items in their designated spots, and began the chants. The air grew cold, and the shadows in the room seemed to come alive, twisting and writhing as if in pain. My heart pounded in my chest, but I forced myself to continue, determined to see it through. As the final chant left my lips, the room plunged into darkness. The whispers returned, louder and more insistent than ever. I could feel their presence, the robed figures surrounding me, their eyes burning with malevolence. I closed my eyes, focusing on the ritual, willing it to work. Suddenly, a blinding light filled the room, and the whispers turned to screams. I opened my eyes to see the robed figures writhing in agony, their forms dissolving into shadows. The light grew brighter, and with a final deafening scream, the room went silent. I collapsed to the floor, exhausted but alive. The cult was gone, their presence lifted, but the scars they left behind would never fully heal. I had confronted the darkness and survived, but I knew the entity would always be lurking in the shadows, waiting for another chance. As I lay there panting and trembling, I realized that curiosity had indeed cost me dearly. I had opened a door that should have remained closed, and in doing so, I had invited something truly terrifying into my life. The nightmare was over, but the fear would never leave me. The mark may have been severed, but the memory of that dark, twisted show would haunt me forever. I hope my story serves as a warning. If you ever come across a hidden Disney show on the dark web, don't watch it. Curiosity might lead you down a path from which there is no return. Life didn't return to normal after the ritual. The shadows that once filled my home had retreated, but they left a lingering sense of unease. I moved through my days like a ghost, haunted by the memories of what I had seen and done. Friends noticed the change in me, but I couldn't tell them the truth. They wouldn't believe me, and even if they did, what could they possibly do to help? Weeks turned into months, and I tried to rebuild some semblance of normalcy. Work became my refuge, a distraction from the gnawing fear that still gripped my heart. I avoided the internet, particularly anything that might lead me back to that dark web rabbit hole. But the past has a way of creeping up on you when you least expect it. One night, as I was getting ready for bed, I heard a knock at my door. It was strange. No one ever visited me this late. I peered through the peephole and saw a man standing there, his face partially hidden by the shadows. Hesitant, I opened the door just a crack. "Yes?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. The man looked up, and I recognized him instantly. It was the same man who had met me at the warehouse, the one who had first warned me about the cult. "We need to talk," he said, his voice urgent. I opened the door wider, letting him in. He looked around nervously before speaking. "They're not gone," he said, his eyes darting around the room, as if expecting the robed figures to appear at any moment. "The ritual only weakened them. They're still out there, and they're angry. They've found a new way to reach you." Panic welled up inside me. "What do you mean? How are they still here?" He pulled out a laptop from his bag and set it on my table. "I've been tracking their activity. They've been using the dark web to recruit more followers, spreading their influence through hidden videos and forums. The video you watched was just the beginning." He opened a file on his laptop, revealing a list of websites and forums, all dedicated to the cult. My heart sank as I realized the extent of their reach. "They're planning something big," he continued, "a mass ritual that will bring their entity into our world, and they're using you as a conduit." The room felt colder, the weight of his words pressing down on me. "What can I do? How do I stop them?" He looked at me, his eyes filled with a mix of fear and determination. "There's another ritual, a final one that can sever their connection to our world completely, but it's dangerous, more dangerous than the first one, and it requires something from you, your blood." My blood ran cold. "My blood? What do you mean?" "The entity is tied to you now, through the video and the rituals you've done. To break the connection, you have to sacrifice a part of yourself." I stared at him, the weight of his words sinking in. The idea of bleeding myself dry to stop this madness was terrifying, but the alternative was unthinkable. "I'll do it," I said finally, my voice trembling but resolute. "Tell me what I need to do." He handed me a small, intricately carved dagger and a piece of parchment covered in strange symbols. "You need to draw these symbols on the floor with your blood, then recite the incantation. But be warned, the cult will know what you're doing. They'll try to stop you." As I took the dagger and parchment, I felt a sense of dread settle over me. This was it, the final battle. I prepared myself mentally and physically, knowing that this might be my last night alive. The man stayed with me, guiding me through the preparation. We drew the symbols together, using candles to illuminate the darkened room. I pricked my finger with the dagger, watching as my blood filled the lines of the symbols. The room seemed to pulse with a dark energy, the shadows growing longer and more oppressive. As I began the incantation, the air grew thick with tension. The shadows in the room started to move, twisting and writhing as if alive. The robed figures appeared, their eyes glowing with malevolence. They chanted in unison, their voices a twisted symphony of darkness. I forced myself to keep going, my voice growing louder as I recited the ancient words. The figures advanced, their presence overwhelming. Just as I felt I couldn't continue, a blinding light filled the room. The figures screamed, their forms disintegrating into smoke and shadows. The light grew brighter, searing through the darkness, and with a final, deafening scream, the cult was gone. The room fell silent, the oppressive energy lifting. I collapsed to the floor, the dagger slipping from my hand. The man knelt beside me, his face a mix of relief and exhaustion. "It's done," he said softly. "You did it." I lay there, panting and trembling, the reality of what had happened slowly sinking in. The cult was defeated, their connection severed, but the cost had been high. My blood, my sanity, my sense of safety. I knew I would never be the same again. As I lay there, the room gradually returning to normal, I realized that I had faced the darkness and survived, but the scars, both physical and mental, would remain. I had won, but at a great cost. And though the cult was gone, the fear and memories would haunt me forever. I hope my story serves as a warning. The dark web is not a place for idle curiosity. There are things out there, ancient and malevolent, that should never be disturbed. If you ever come across a hidden Disney show, or anything else that promises dark secrets, turn away. Curiosity can lead to horror beyond imagination, and some doors, once opened, can never be closed again. Life after the final ritual was a strange and fragile calm. The robed figures were gone, and the malevolent presence had lifted, but I was a changed person. My sleep was plagued by nightmares, and every shadow seemed to hide a lurking threat. I avoided the dark web entirely, not even daring to think about it, but as time passed, a gnawing sense of unfinished business grew within me. I tried to resume a normal life, but something kept pulling me back to that night, to the rituals, and to the dark entity. The fear had subsided, but a new unsettling curiosity had taken its place. I needed to understand what had happened, to make sense of the madness I had endured. I started reading about occult practices, ancient rituals, and the history of the cult. The more I learned, the more questions I had. One day, as I was poring over old texts in a dusty corner of the local library, I stumbled upon a reference to an ancient book known as the Codex Maleficarum. It was said to contain knowledge about dark entities and the rituals needed to banish them. Intrigued, I decided to find this book, hoping it would provide the answers I sought. My search led me to a rare book dealer on the outskirts of the town. The shop was a cramped, dimly lit space, filled with shelves overflowing with old tomes and scrolls. The air was thick with the scent of aged paper and leather. The proprietor, an elderly man with sharp eyes and a knowing smile, watched me as I browsed. "You're looking for something specific," he said, his voice soft but firm. I nodded. "The Codex Maleficarum. Do you have it?" He raised an eyebrow, a hint of surprise flickering across his face. "That's not a book for casual readers. It's dangerous." "I need to understand," I replied, the desperation clear in my voice. He studied me for a moment before nodding slowly. "I do have a copy, but it's not for sale. You can read it here under my supervision." He led me to a small private room at the back of the shop and handed me a thick, leather-bound book. The cover was adorned with strange symbols, and the pages were yellowed with age. As I opened it, I felt a chill run down my spine. The text was dense and difficult to read, but I persevered, driven by the need to understand. The codex detailed the history of the dark entity I had encountered, describing it as an ancient being that fed on fear and suffering. It had been worshipped by various cults throughout history, each performing rituals to summon and control it. The book also described ways to banish the entity permanently, but the methods were complex and dangerous. As I read, I came across a passage that made my blood run cold. It spoke of a final confrontation, a ritual that could sever the entity's connection to our world forever. But it required a great sacrifice, the life of someone who had been marked by the entity. The words blurred as tears filled my eyes. Had I really escaped, or was I still in its grasp? The shopkeeper must have noticed my distress. He placed a hand on my shoulder, his expression somber. "You've been through a lot," he said gently, "but you're not alone in this. There are others who have faced similar horrors. Together, we might be able to find a way." He introduced me to a group of people who had also encountered the entity. They were survivors like me, each bearing their own scars. We shared our stories, finding solace in each other's experiences. They had formed a network dedicated to studying the entity and finding a way to banish it for good. Together, we decided to perform the final ritual described in the Codex. It was a dangerous undertaking, but we were determined to end the entity's reign of terror once and for all. We gathered the necessary items and prepared ourselves mentally and physically for what lay ahead. The night of the ritual, we met in a secluded clearing deep in the woods. The air was heavy with anticipation as we drew the symbols on the ground and placed the items in their designated spots. I stood at the center, the focus of the ritual, my heart pounding in my chest. As we began the chants, the air grew cold and the shadows seemed to come alive. The presence of the entity was palpable, a malevolent force pressing down on us. The others continued the chants, their voices growing louder and more insistent. I closed my eyes, focusing on the words, willing the ritual to work. Suddenly, the ground beneath me began to tremble. The shadows coalesced into the robed figures, their eyes burning with a sinister light. They advanced, their chants merging with ours in a twisted harmony of darkness and light. I felt a sharp pain in my chest, as if my very soul was being torn apart. But I didn't stop. I kept chanting, my voice rising above the cacophony. The pain grew more intense, and I could feel the entity's grip tightening. Just when I thought I couldn't bear it any longer, a blinding light erupted from the symbols on the ground, enveloping us in its brilliance. The robed figures screamed, their forms dissolving into smoke and shadows. The light grew brighter, searing through the darkness, and with a final deafening scream, the entity was gone. The ground stopped trembling, and the air grew still. We had done it. We had severed the connection. I collapsed to the ground, exhausted but alive. The others rushed to my side, their faces filled with relief and triumph. We had faced the darkness together and emerged victorious. The entity was banished, its connection to our world severed forever. As we made our way back to civilization, I felt a sense of peace wash over me. The nightmares and fears that had haunted me for so long began to fade. I knew the scars would remain, but I had found strength in facing the darkness and in the support of others who had shared my ordeal. The experience had changed me in ways I couldn't fully understand. I had confronted an ancient evil and survived, and though the shadows still lurked at the edges of my mind, I knew I had the strength to face whatever came next. I hope my story serves as a warning and a beacon of hope. The dark web is a treacherous place, filled with horrors beyond imagination. But even in the darkest of times, there is strength to be found in facing our fears and in the support of those who stand with us. If you ever come across something that promises dark secrets and untold horrors, turn away. Curiosity can lead to unimaginable terror, but courage and solidarity can help us find our way back to the light. In the weeks following the ritual, I tried to rebuild my life with a new sense of purpose. The network of survivors became a support group and a family. We had faced the unimaginable together and emerged stronger. However, I knew that the shadows of my past would always linger, a constant reminder of the horrors I had faced. One evening, while attending a group meeting, an old friend from my pre-dark web days, Emily, showed up. She had heard whispers about my ordeal and was deeply concerned. We had lost touch over the years, but her sudden reappearance felt like a beacon of normalcy in my turbulent life. Over coffee, I told Emily everything. She listened intently, her eyes wide with disbelief and horror. When I finished, she reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "I'm so sorry you went through that," she said softly. "But I'm here now. You're not alone." Her support meant the world to me, and slowly, with her help and the help of the group, I began to heal. Life started to regain a semblance of normalcy. I returned to work, rekindled old friendships, and even started going out again. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I could breathe. One night, I decided to check my email, something I had avoided since the ordeal began. My inbox was filled with the usual spam and work-related messages, but one email stood out. The subject line was simple: "You need to see this." It was from an unknown sender. My heart raced as I clicked on it. The email contained a single link and a brief message. "They're not done. They're coming for you." Panic set in, but I couldn't help myself. I clicked the link, which led to a dark web forum dedicated to the cult. My blood ran cold as I read through the posts. The cult had regrouped, and they were planning a new ritual, one more powerful and dangerous than before. They were determined to bring the entity back, and I was still their primary target. I knew I had to act quickly. I contacted the network of survivors, and we devised a plan to stop the cult once and for all. This time, we wouldn't just banish the entity, we would dismantle the cult from within. We spent the next few weeks gathering information, infiltrating their forums, and tracking their movements. It was dangerous work, but we were determined. The final confrontation took place in an abandoned church on the outskirts of town, a place the cult had chosen for its dark history. We arrived just before midnight, armed with everything we needed to perform a counter-ritual. The air was thick with tension as we entered the church, our footsteps echoing in the silence. The cult was already there, their robed figures standing in a circle, chanting in a language that sent shivers down my spine. At the center of the circle was an altar, and on it lay a person bound and gagged, a sacrifice. My heart ached as I realized how far the cult was willing to go. We had to act fast. We split into groups, each with a specific task. Some of us would perform the counter-ritual, while others would disrupt the cult's ceremony and rescue the victim. As the chants grew louder, we moved into position. I joined the group performing the counter-ritual, my hands trembling as I drew the symbols on the ground. We began our chants, our voices rising above the cacophony of the cult's incantations. The air grew colder, and the shadows seemed to come alive, twisting and writhing as if in pain. The cult members turned towards us, their eyes burning with malevolence. A fierce struggle ensued. The survivors fought bravely, disrupting the cult's ceremony and freeing the victim. But the real battle was within the circle. As our chants grew louder, the ground beneath us began to tremble. The robed figures screamed, their forms disintegrating into smoke and shadows. The light from our symbols grew brighter, searing through the darkness, and with a final deafening scream, the entity was banished once more. The church fell silent, the oppressive energy lifting. We had done it. The cult was defeated, their connection to the entity severed forever. The victim was safe, and the survivors had emerged victorious. As we made our way out of the church, the first light of dawn breaking on the horizon, I felt a profound sense of peace. The nightmare was finally over. The shadows that had haunted me were gone, and I knew I could begin to rebuild my life without fear. Emily was waiting for me outside, her face filled with relief and pride. She wrapped me in a tight hug, and for the first time in a long time, I felt truly safe. The experience had changed me, but it had also given me strength and purpose. I knew that the dark web still held many dangers, and there were still those who sought to exploit its horrors. But I also knew that I wasn't alone. I had friends, a support network, and a newfound resilience. As I walked away from the church, I made a vow to myself. I would continue to fight against the darkness, to protect others from the horrors I had faced. The dark web had taken much from me, but it had also given me a mission, a reason to keep going. I hope my story serves as both a warning and a beacon of hope. The dark web is a dangerous place, filled with unimaginable horrors, but even in the darkest times, there is strength in facing our fears and in the support of those who stand with us. If you ever come across something that promises dark secrets and untold horrors, turn away. Curiosity can lead to unimaginable terror, but courage and solidarity can help us find our way back to the light. My son went missing, age 13. I just found a photo of him on the dark web. Hey everyone, I'm not sure if this is the right place to post this, but I need to get this off my chest and maybe get some advice. My son Jake went missing 3 years ago when he was 13. He was a happy, normal kid, loved video games and soccer. One day, he just didn't come home from school. We searched everywhere. The police were involved, but it was like he vanished into thin air. The first few months were the hardest. Every time the phone rang, my heart would jump, hoping it was someone with information. We put up posters, did interviews, hired private investigators. Nothing. It was like he had been erased from existence. I couldn't sleep, couldn't eat. My wife Lisa tried to stay strong, but I could see she was breaking down too. Our lives became a nightmare. I started spending more time online, joining forums and support groups for missing children. That's when I stumbled upon the dark web. I'd heard about it before, mostly as a place for illegal activity, but I was desperate. I thought maybe, just maybe, there'd be something there. Some clue, some hint. Navigating the dark web was terrifying. I felt like I was wading through filth, the kind of stuff that makes you want to take a shower just for looking at it. Drugs, weapons, human trafficking. But I kept searching, using every tool and tip I could find. I joined shady forums, engaged with people who made my skin crawl. all in the hope of finding something about Jake. Months turned into years. I was on the brink of giving up when I found it. It was a photo on a sick, twisted site, the kind where you had to pay in Bitcoin to access certain areas. I felt sick even opening it, but there it was, a photo of Jake. He looked older, maybe 16 or 17 now, but it was definitely him. He was standing in a dark room, wearing clothes I'd never seen before, looking scared out of his mind. I screamed for Lisa, but she was out. I sat there staring at the screen, trying to process what I was seeing. There was a symbol behind him on the wall, something I'd never seen before. It looked like a pentagram, but twisted in some way. I knew I had to find out more. I went deeper, paying more Bitcoin to access the chat rooms and message boards. I found a group discussing that symbol. They talked about rituals, sacrifices, and things that made my blood run cold. I knew I was dealing with something far darker than I'd ever imagined. The next few weeks were a blur. I barely slept, barely ate. I quit my job. Lisa and I were already struggling to hold our marriage together, and this was the final nail in the coffin. She moved out, saying she couldn't handle it anymore. I didn't blame her. I was obsessed. I started communicating with some of the people on the site. I pretended to be interested in their sick cult, hoping to get information. They were cautious, but after weeks of chatting and proving myself, they started to trust me. They told me about their rituals, about how they believe they can gain power and immortality through sacrifices. They talked about preparing the children, breaking their spirits. I felt like I was going insane. I wanted to reach through the screen and strangle these monsters, but I had to play it cool. I had to find out where Jake was. Finally, I got a lead. One of them slipped up and mentioned a location, an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of a town. I grabbed my gun, a flashlight, and headed out. The place was exactly as they described, run down and creepy as hell. I forced the door open and stepped inside. The smell hit me first, a mix of rot and something metallic. Blood. My heart pounded as I moved through the darkness, my flashlight flickering over old rusted equipment and what looked like makeshift altars. I found a room at the back, locked with a heavy chain. I shut the lock off and pushed the door open. Inside, there were cages, actual cages, like for animals, and there, in the corner, huddled and scared, was Jake. He looked up, eyes wide with fear, and then recognition. "Dad?" he whispered. I rushed over, fumbling with the cage door, tears streaming down my face. He was thin, too thin, and his eyes were hollow, but he was alive. I hugged him, promising I'd get him out of there, that we'd be okay. But as I turned to leave, I heard footsteps. The cult members were here. I hid Jake in one of the dark corners, telling him to stay quiet, and then I faced them. There were 3 of them, dressed in those sick robes, carrying knives. My heart was pounding, but I wasn't going to let them take my son again. I raised my gun and fired, hitting one in the chest. The others rushed me, and I fought like a man possessed. Somehow, I managed to overpower them, but not without getting hurt. I was bleeding, but I didn't care. I grabbed Jake, and we ran. We didn't stop until we were far away from that hellhole. We found a motel, and I called the police. They came, took our statements, and promised to investigate. But I knew it wasn't over. The cult was out there, and they wouldn't stop until they got what they wanted. That night, as Jake slept, I felt a strange chill in the room. I looked around, but there was nothing, just shadows. I told myself it was just my imagination, but deep down, I knew. We were cursed, and this was just the beginning. After that night, life didn't just go back to normal. Jake was traumatized, and I could see the fear in his eyes every time we heard a noise or saw a stranger. We stayed in that motel for a few days while the police investigated the warehouse. They found evidence of the cult's activities, but not nearly enough to take down the entire operation. It was like trying to fight a shadow. The detective assigned to our case, Detective Reynolds, was sympathetic but overworked. Missing kids, cults, dark web activities. It was a lot for any police department to handle. He promised to do his best, but I could tell he didn't have much hope. "These people are like ghosts," he said. "They disappear as soon as you shine a light on them." Jake was given a thorough medical checkup. Physically, he was malnourished and dehydrated, but otherwise okay. Mentally, he was a wreck. He wouldn't talk about what had happened to him, and I didn't press him. I figured he'd talk when he was ready. Instead, I focused on keeping him safe. I moved us into a small, rundown apartment far from the warehouse. It wasn't much, but it was the best I could afford after losing my job. I was paranoid, checking the locks multiple times, setting up makeshift alarms, and sleeping with my gun under the pillow. I started homeschooling Jake, trying to give him some semblance of a normal life. One night, I was going through my emails when I got a message from an unknown sender. The subject line read, "We know where you are." My heart sank. I opened it, and there was a single line of text. "You can't escape us." Attached was a photo of Jake and me in the motel room. They had been watching us. I felt sick to my stomach. I called Detective Reynolds, but there wasn't much he could do. "We'll increase patrols in the area," he said, but I could hear the helplessness in his voice. We were on our own. The next few days were a blur of fear and paranoia. I barely let Jake out of my sight. One afternoon, while Jake was napping, I heard a knock on the door. I peeked through the peephole and saw a woman standing there, looking normal enough, but something about her seemed off. I didn't open the door. "Who is it?" I asked. "I'm here to help," she said. "I know about the cult." My heart skipped a beat. Against my better judgment, I opened the door, but kept the chain on. "Who are you?" "My name is Sarah," she said. "I used to be one of them." She looked scared, constantly glancing over her shoulder. I let her in, and she told me her story. She had been recruited by the cult when she was a teenager, drawn in by promises of power and belonging. But it wasn't long before she realized what they really were. Monsters. She managed to escape a few years ago and had been in hiding ever since. "They won't stop until they get Jake back," she said. "They believe he's special, chosen. They won't let him go that easily." I felt a cold chill run down my spine. "What do you mean, chosen?" "They believe he has a special connection to their god, their demon, whatever it is they worship," she explained. "They'll do anything to get him back." I was shaking. "What do I do?" "You need to leave," she said. "Change your names, disappear. They have eyes everywhere." It felt like a punch to the gut. I had just gotten Jake back, and now I had to uproot our lives again. But what choice did I have? Sarah gave me some money and a burner phone. "I'll be in touch," she said. "But be careful. Trust no one." I packed up our things and woke Jake. He was groggy and confused, but didn't question me. We left the apartment and drove until we were out of the city. I found a cheap motel in a small town and checked in under fake names. I told Jake we were going on a little adventure, trying to keep things light. but I could see the fear in his eyes. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every noise made me jump. Every shadow seemed to hide a threat. Around 3 a.m., the burner phone rang. It was Sarah. "They're onto you," she said. "You need to leave now." I didn't ask how she knew. I grabbed Jake and we left everything behind, driving aimlessly through the night. We ended up in another small town, another cheap motel. I felt like we were running out of options, out of places to hide. The next day, Sarah called again. "There's a place you can go," she said. "A safe house. It's off the grid, run by people who know how to deal with these cults." She gave me the address and we drove there, hoping it would be safe. The house was in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by dense forest. An older man named John greeted us. He looked tough, with a stern face and scars that told stories of their own. "Welcome," he said. "You'll be safe here for now." As we settled in, John explained that he and a few others had been fighting these cults for years. "They're like a cancer," he said. "You cut one part out and another one pops up. But we've learned how to survive." For the first time in months, I felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe, just maybe, we could find a way out of this nightmare. But deep down, I knew it wasn't going to be that easy. The cult was relentless, and they wouldn't stop until they had Jake. We were safe for now, but the fight was far from over. The first few days at the safe house were tense, but somewhat reassuring. John and the others were prepared for almost anything. The house was fortified with hidden cameras, reinforced doors, and an extensive underground bunker. They had weapons and supplies, and they knew how to stay off the radar. It felt like we were in good hands, but the constant fear lingered. Jake slowly started to open up. He told me bits and pieces about what had happened to him. The cult had taken him to various locations, kept him in different places to avoid detection. They'd starved him, beaten him, tried to break him, but he also mentioned something that made my blood run cold. They had tried to indoctrinate him, make him believe in their twisted religion. They called him the Chosen One, claiming he was destined for a great ritual. John listened intently to Jake's stories. "We've heard about these rituals," he said. "They believe sacrificing a Chosen One will bring them immense power. It's all bullshit, but they're convinced it's real. That's why they're so determined to get him back." We settled into a routine at the safe house. Jake and I helped with chores, tried to keep our minds occupied, but at night, the fear would creep in. I'd lie awake, listening for any sounds, wondering if they had found us. One evening, John gathered everyone together. "We need to be prepared," he said. "We have reason to believe they're getting closer." He explained that he had intercepted some communications from the cult. They were mobilizing, planning something big. "We need to be ready to defend ourselves," he said. That night, as we huddled in the bunker, I could see the fear in Jake's eyes. "Dad, are they going to find us?" he asked. I hugged him tightly. "I won't let them take you again," I promised. But deep down, I wasn't sure I could keep that promise. The next few days were a blur of preparation and waiting. We fortified the house even more, set up additional traps and alarms. Everyone was on edge. Then one night, it happened. The alarms went off, and the safe house was under attack. John and the others sprang into action, grabbing their weapons and taking up defensive positions. "Stay with Jake," John shouted at me. "Keep him safe." I took Jake, and we hid in the bunker. The sounds of gunfire and shouting echoed above us. My heart was pounding, my hands shaking. I held Jake close, trying to keep him calm. "It's going to be okay," I whispered, more to convince myself than him. The battle above seemed to go on forever. The bunker was dark and claustrophobic, and the noise was deafening. Finally, after what felt like hours, there was silence. I waited, listening, afraid to move. Then the bunker door opened, and John appeared, covered in blood and looking exhausted. "It's over," he said. "For now." We emerged from the bunker to find the safe house in ruins. Several of John's people were dead or injured. The cult had been relentless, but we had fought them off for now. I looked at the carnage and felt a mix of relief and dread. We had survived, but at what cost? John limped over to me. "We can't stay here," he said. "They'll be back, and in greater numbers." We packed up what we could and left the safe house. John led us to another location, a temporary hideout. He was badly injured, but he insisted on keeping us safe. "This isn't over," he said. "They'll keep coming until they get what they want." Over the next few days, we moved from place to place, always one step ahead of the cult. It was exhausting, and the constant fear was wearing us down. Then one night, Sarah contacted me. "I've found something," she said. "A way to end this." She told me about a ritual, one that could break the cult's power over Jake. It was risky, but it was our only hope. "You need to perform the ritual at the place where they first took Jake," she said. "It's the only way to sever the connection." I didn't like the sound of it, but we were out of options. John agreed to help, despite his injuries. We made our way back to the warehouse where it all began. The place was abandoned, but the memories of that night came flooding back. Sarah met us there, bringing with her the necessary items for the ritual. Candles, symbols, herbs. It all felt surreal. "We have to do this exactly as instructed," she said. "Any mistake could make things worse." We set everything up, and I held Jake's hand, trying to reassure him. Sarah began the ritual, chanting in a language I didn't understand. The air grew thick, and a cold wind swept through the warehouse. I felt a presence, something dark and malevolent. As the ritual reached its climax, Jake began to convulse. I held him tightly, terrified but determined. The symbols on the floor glowed, and a blinding light filled the room. I felt a force trying to pull Jake away, but I held on with all my strength. Then as suddenly as it began, it was over. The light faded, and Jake collapsed in my arms, unconscious but breathing. Sarah looked exhausted but relieved. "It's done," she said. "The connection is broken." We left the warehouse, hoping it was truly over. Jake slowly recovered, and we moved to a new town, trying to rebuild our lives. But the nightmares continued, and the fear never really went away. We were free, but the scars would always remain, and sometimes, late at night, I still feel that presence, watching, waiting. The cult may have lost their hold on Jake, but the darkness lingers, a reminder that true evil never really dies. The months following the ritual were a mix of cautious hope and lingering dread. Jake was slowly returning to some semblance of normalcy, attending school under a new name, making new friends. But the nightmares persisted. Every night, he'd wake up screaming, and I'd rush to his side, trying to calm him down. It was taking a toll on both of us. I started seeing a therapist, trying to process everything that had happened. It helped, but there was always a part of me that remained on edge, waiting for the other shoe to drop. We moved to a quiet town, far away from the city and the warehouse, hoping for a fresh start. I found a job at a local hardware store, and Jake seemed to be adjusting well to his new school, but the sense of foreboding never left. One evening, I was closing up the store when I noticed a familiar symbol spray painted on the side of the building. It was the twisted pentagram from the cult. My heart sank. They had found us again. I rushed home, feeling the panic rising. I had drilled escape plans into Jake's head, but I didn't want to uproot him again unless it was absolutely necessary. When I got home, I found Jake sitting at the kitchen table, staring at a piece of paper. His face was pale, and his hands were shaking. "Dad," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "They left this in my locker." He handed me the paper. It was a crudely drawn version of the same symbol, with a message, "We are coming." I felt a surge of anger and fear. We had done everything right, everything we could to escape, and they were still after us. I called Sarah, who had become a trusted friend and ally. She answered on the first ring. "They found us," I said, my voice trembling. "What do we do?" There was a pause on the other end. "You need to come back," she said finally. "We need to finish this once and for all." Sarah explained that the ritual we had performed had only severed the immediate connection between Jake and the cult, but their power and influence were still very much alive. "There's another ritual," she said, "one that can destroy their hold for good, but it's dangerous and it requires both you and Jake." I didn't like the sound of it, but we were out of options. We packed our things and left town in the middle of the night. Sarah had given me the address of a remote cabin deep in the woods, far from prying eyes. John was already there, looking even more battered than before, but determined to help us see this through. The cabin was rustic but sturdy, surrounded by dense forest. It felt isolated, which was both comforting and terrifying. Sarah greeted us at the door, her face etched with worry. "We don't have much time," she said. "They're coming." We went inside and Sarah laid out the plan. The ritual required us to confront the darkness head-on, to face our worst fears. It would be a battle of wills, and there was no guarantee of success. "But if we don't try," she said, "they'll never stop. They'll keep coming for Jake. And for you." We set up the ritual space in the basement, a cold, damp room that made my skin crawl. Candles, symbols, and ancient texts covered the floor and walls. Sarah explained that we would be summoning the entity that the cult worshipped, binding it, and then destroying its connection to this world. As we prepared, Jake clung to my side, his eyes wide with fear. "Dad, I'm scared," he said. I hugged him tightly. "I am too," I admitted. "But we have to do this. We have to end it. Once and for all." Sarah began the ritual, chanting in that strange, ancient language. The air grew heavy, and the room seemed to close in around us. I felt a pressure in my chest, a suffocating darkness that made it hard to breathe. Jake squeezed my hand, and I squeezed back, trying to draw strength from his presence. The candles flickered, and the shadows seemed to dance and writhe. I felt a presence, a cold, malevolent force that filled the room. Sarah's chanting grew louder, more urgent, and the pressure intensified. I could see shapes in the darkness, twisted, monstrous forms that seemed to reach out for us. Suddenly, Jake screamed, his body convulsing. I tried to hold him, but the force was too strong. I could see the entity now, a shadowy figure with burning eyes, filled with hatred and malice. It reached for Jake, and I felt a surge of panic. "Focus," Sarah shouted. "You have to fight it." I closed my eyes, trying to block out the fear, the darkness. I thought of Jake, of everything we had been through, and I felt a spark of determination. I wouldn't let this thing take him. I wouldn't let it win. The chanting reached a fever pitch, and the entity screamed, a sound that tore through my soul. The symbols on the floor glowed, and the air crackled with energy. I held on to Jake, pouring all my love and strength into him, willing him to fight. There was a blinding flash of light, and the entity recoiled, its form dissolving into nothingness. The pressure lifted, and the room fell silent. I felt a wave of relief, and then exhaustion. Jake collapsed into my arms, unconscious, but alive. Sarah slumped to the floor, looking drained but triumphant. "It's done," she said, her voice barely audible. "They can't hurt you anymore." We stayed in the cabin for a few days, recovering from the ordeal. John and Sarah took turns keeping watch, just in case. But there were no signs of the cult, no threats or warnings. It was finally over. As we left the cabin, I felt a sense of peace for the first time in years. We had faced the darkness and won. We were free, but the scars remained, a reminder of the nightmare we had lived through. We moved to a new town, far away from everything that had happened. Jake started school again, and I found a job. We began to rebuild our lives piece by piece. The nightmares still came, but they were less frequent, and we faced them together. And sometimes, late at night, I'd look at Jake and remember the terror, the pain, but I'd also remember the strength, the love that had carried us through. We had faced the darkness and survived, and we were stronger for it. But deep down, I knew the shadows would always be there, lurking at the edges of our lives. We could never forget, but we could move forward, one step at a time, and that was enough, for now. Life slowly started to return to a new kind of normal. The nightmares that had plagued Jake were becoming less frequent, and he was beginning to enjoy his new school and make friends. We settled into a routine, and for the first time in years, I felt a sense of peace. However, the experience had left deep scars on both of us. We were constantly looking over our shoulders, jumping at shadows. I tried to hide my anxiety from Jake, but he could see right through me. "Dad, are we really safe now?" he would ask, and I'd reassure him, though I wasn't always sure myself. One afternoon, while sorting through the few belongings we had brought with us, I found a small, worn-out notebook. It was one of the journals I had kept during our ordeal, documenting everything that had happened. I debated whether to keep it or throw it away. In the end, I decided to keep it, a reminder of what we had overcome and the strength we had found in each other. As the months passed, I started seeing a therapist regularly. The sessions helped me process the trauma and the guilt that had been weighing me down. I encouraged Jake to see a counselor as well, and slowly, he began to open up about his experiences. It was painful to hear, but necessary for his healing. One evening, after a particularly good day at school, Jake came home with a smile on his face. "Dad, I made the soccer team," he announced. It was the first genuine smile I had seen from him in a long time. I felt a surge of pride and relief. Maybe, just maybe, we were finally starting to heal. But the past wasn't done with us yet. Late one night, the burner phone Sarah had given me rang. My heart skipped a beat. I hadn't heard from her in months. "Hello?" "It's Sarah," she said, her voice tense. "I need to see you. It's urgent." We arranged to meet at a cafe in a nearby town. I left Jake with a trusted neighbor and drove to the meeting place, my mind racing with possibilities. When I arrived, Sarah was already there, looking more worn and haggard than ever. "They're not done," she said, her voice low and urgent. "The cult has reformed, stronger and more determined. They've found a new chosen one, but they haven't forgotten about Jake." I felt a cold dread settle in my stomach. "What do we do?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. Sarah handed me a file, thick with documents and photos. "We need to take the fight to them. We can't keep running. It's time to end this once and for all." The file contained information about the cult's new location, their members, and their plans. It was clear they were preparing for another major ritual, and time was running out. Sarah had already assembled a small group of people willing to fight, including John. I knew what I had to do, but the thought of putting Jake at risk again was almost too much to bear. "I don't want him involved," I said. "He's been through enough." "He won't be," Sarah assured me. "We'll keep him safe, but we need your help." I agreed, and we started making plans. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of preparation and strategy. We gathered supplies, weapons, and anything else we might need. Jake knew something was up, but I kept the details vague. "We're going to make sure we're safe, once and for all," I told him. The night of the confrontation, I left Jake with Sarah's friend, who promised to keep him safe. Our small group drove to the cult's new hideout, an abandoned mansion deep in the woods. The air was thick with tension and fear, but we were determined. We approached the mansion under the cover of darkness, moving silently and quickly. John and the others took up positions around the perimeter, while Sarah and I made our way inside. The place was eerily quiet, but we knew they were there. We found them in a large room at the center of the mansion, gathered around an altar. The new chosen one, a terrified young boy, was bound and surrounded by the cult members. Their leader, a tall, gaunt man with piercing eyes, was chanting in that same ancient language. Sarah signaled, and we moved in. The fight was brutal and chaotic. Shots were fired, and screams echoed through the halls. I fought with everything I had, driven by the need to protect Jake and end this nightmare. At one point, I faced the cult leader. He looked at me with a sneer, his eyes filled with madness. "You can't stop us," he hissed. "Our God will rise." I raised my gun, my hand steady. "Not if I have anything to say about it." I pulled the trigger and he fell, his chant dying on his lips. The remaining cult members scattered, their resolve broken. We freed the boy and quickly left the mansion, setting it ablaze as we went. The fire roared, consuming the darkness within. We returned to the safe house, exhausted but victorious. The cult was finally defeated, their power broken. As I hugged Jake, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. We were finally free. The weeks that followed were filled with healing and rebuilding. The boy we had rescued was reunited with his family, and our small group disbanded, each of us returning to our lives. Jake and I moved to a new town, far from the memories of the past. We never forgot what had happened, but we learned to live with it. The fear was still there, but it no longer controlled us. We had faced the darkness and come out the other side, stronger and more united than ever. And sometimes, late at night, I'd look at Jake, sleeping peacefully, and feel a sense of peace. We had been through hell and back, but we had survived. And as long as we had each other, I knew we could face anything.